up with a bipartisan plan to meet our debt threat. All of us have that obligation. All of us have that responsibility. I thank the Chair and yield the floor.
The Senator from Iowa. The Senator will be notified.
Mr. President, I've been a long-time supporter of free trade. I believe it is always a good thing when American businesses and manufacturers and farmers have more market access for their products. I've also been a long-time supporter of specific free trade agreements that are waiting to be acted on by the Congress, the South Korea, the Colombia, and Panama agreements. We've had too many years of talking about being a long-time supporter of free trade agreements, yet we have not had an opportunity to back up our talk with votes because we can't vote until the President presents them to the Congress. The time to present these free trade agreements is long overdue. The administration needs to stop moving the goalposts every time we're about to kick the ball through. Take the Panama Agreement as an example. The United States and Panama reached an agreement in principle December 2006. However, congressional Democrats expressed concern regarding certain labor issues that existed in Panama at the time, and the Bush administration negotiated a deal with the congressional Democrats who had newly taken over the Congress on an announcement, on an agreement that was announced May 10, 2007. As a result, then, President Bush addressed the labor issues in the trade agreement that the United States signed with Panama in late June 2007. Now, you would think if there was a big news conference on May the 10th, 2007, that there's been an agreement reached. Wouldn't you think that these agreements would be passed by now, but not so 4 years later? Despite the fact that the demands made by congressional Democrats were incorporated in the signed trade deal, congressional Democrats would not allow a vote on the agreement. Instead, they moved the goalposts by demanding more changes be made by the Panamanian government. After President Obama took office, the trade issue was sidelined. Along with others, I made a case that trade agreements needed to be a part of America's economic recovery effort. I got an opportunity to make the case directly to the President December 2009. Then in January 2010, the President said in a message to Congress that he wanted to double exports within the next 5 years. That's a very worthy goal. Well, it's pretty hard to double exports and help employers create jobs while ignoring these trade agreements. Supporters of free trade and the jobs supported by trade average about 15% above the national average. So we're talking about good jobs, so there's reasons to keep the pressure on. Finally, after many months of waiting, the trade ambassador went back to work to get the Panamanian government to agree to meet the additional demands set out by congressional Democrats in the Obama administration. The ambassador also set out to gain further commitment from South Korea and Colombia. Now the Panamanian government has addressed the additional demands by making the necessary amendments to their laws. The additional concerns that the administration had with the South Korea and Colombian deals were addressed as well. Earlier this May, Ambassador Kirk indicated that all three trade agreements were ready for Congress to consider. But the Obama administration decided to move the goalpost once again. Instead of moving these agreements forward for swift approval to help the economy move along, the swift approval which I believe they will receive when they get a vote, the administration now has another requirement, approval of the Trade Adjustment Assistance. While U.S. manufacturers and businesses and farmers risk losing more and more market share in these countries, Democrats keep coming up with reasons for holding up these trade agreements, moving the goalposts. There is simply no reason to keep on moving the goalposts. The administration has said these three trade agreements are ready. One of the best things that we can do right now for U.S. businesses, farmers, and workers is to implement these trade agreements, which will give a much-needed boost to our economy. I'm not suggesting that we do nothing on trade adjustment assistance, because I support that 40-year-old program. But reaching an agreement on that program should not be used as another excuse for moving the goalposts. All three of the pending trade agreements need to be sent to Congress without further delay. I yield back the balance of my time and yield the floor.
The Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, the United States Senate is preparing to pass another 4-year extension of the USA Patriot Act. I've served on the Intelligence Committee for over a decade, and I want to deliver a warning this afternoon. When the American people find out how their government has secretly interpreted the Patriot Act, they are going to be stunned and they are going to be angry. And they're going to ask senators, did you know what this law actually permits? Why didn't you know before you voted on it? The fact is, anyone can read the plain text of the Patriot Act, and yet many members of Congress have no idea how the law is being secretly interpreted by the executive branch, because that interpretation is classified. It's almost as if there were two Patriot Acts, and many members of Congress have not read the one that matters. Our constituents, of course, are totally in the dark. Members of the public have no access to the secret legal interpretations, so they have no idea what their government believes the law actually means. And I'm going to bring up several historical examples to try to demonstrate what this has meant over the years. And before I begin, I want to be clear that I'm not claiming that any of the specific activities I discussed today are happening now. I'm bringing them up because I believe they are a reminder of how the American people react when they learn about domestic surveillance activities that are not consistent with what they believe the law allows. When Americans learn about intelligence activities that are consistent with their understanding of the law, they look to the news media, they follow these activities with interest and often admiration. But when people learn about intelligence activities that are outside the lines of what is generally thought to be the law, the reaction can get negative, and get negative in a hurry. So here's my first example. The CIA was established by the National Security Act of 1947, and the law stated that the agency was, quote, forbidden to have law enforcement powers or internal security functions. Members of the Congress and legal experts interpreted that language as a clear prohibition against any internal security function under any circumstances. A group of CIA officials had a different interpretation. They decided that the 1947 law contained legal gray areas that allowed the CIA to monitor American citizens for possible contact with foreign agents. They believed this meant that they could secretly tap Americans' phones, open their mail, and plant listening devices in their homes, among other things. The secret legal interpretation led the CIA to maintain intelligence files on more than 10,000 American citizens, including reporters, members of Congress, and a host of anti-war activists. This small group of CIA officials kept the program and their, quote, gray area justification of the program a secret from the American people, and most of the government, because they argued revealing it would violate the agency's responsibility to protect intelligence sources and methods from unauthorized disclosure. Did the program stay a secret? Mr. President, it didn't, and on December 22, 1974, investigative reporter Seymour Hersh detailed the program on the front pages of the New York Times. The revelations and the huge public uproar that ensued led to the formation of the Church Committee. That committee spent nearly 2 years investigating questionable and illegal activity at the CIA. The Church Committee published 14 reports detailing various intelligence abuses, which, in addition to illegal domestic surveillance, included programs designed to assassinate foreign leaders. The investigation led to executive orders reining in the authority of the CIA and the creation of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. In 1947, President Harry Truman and his top military and legal advisors secretly approved a program named Project Shamrock. Project Shamrock authorized the Armed Forces Security Agency and its successor, the NSA, to monitor telegraphs coming in and out of the United States. At the outset of the program, companies were told that government agents would only read, quote, those telegrams related to foreign intelligence targets. But as the program grew, more telegrams were sent and received by Americans, and they were read. During the program's 30-year run, the NSA analysts sometimes reviewed as many as 150,000 telegrams a month. While the Ford administration said that it made all pertinent information about Project Shamrock available to the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Justice Department, it kept the program secret from the public. They argued that public disclosure was both unjustified and dangerous to national security, and it avoided Congress questions regarding the legality of the program by stating that the telegrams present somewhat different legal questions from those posed by domestic bugging and wiretapping. And that program didn't stay secret either. The newly formed Senate Intelligence Committee ultimately disclosed the Project Shamrock program on November 6, 1975, arguing that public disclosure was needed to build support for a law governing NSA operations. That resulting public uproar led to a congressional investigation, the NSA's termination of Project Shamrock, and the passage of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978, which attempted to subject domestic surveillance to a process of warrants and judicial review. Years later, during the Reagan administration, senior members of the National Security Council secretly sold arms to Iran and used the funds to arm and train Contra militants to topple the Nicaraguan government. Selling arms to Iran violated the official U.S. arms embargo against Iran, and directly funding the Contras was illegal under the Boland Amendment. That was the one Congress passed to limit U.S. government assistance to the Contras. But the officials at the National Security Council were convinced they knew better. They were convinced that violating the embargo and illegally supporting the Contra rebels would help free American hostages and help fight communism in Nicaragua. Instead of engaging in a public debate and trying to convince the Congress and the public they were right, they secretly launched an arms program and hid it from the Congress and the American people. Now, how did that work out for them? Now, the New York Times published the story of these activities on November 25, 1986. The Joint Congressional Committee was launched to investigate the Iran-Contra affair, which televised hearings for over a month. The House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House and Senate Intelligence Committees held their own hearings. The first presidential commission investigating the National Security Council was launched. Multiple reports were published documenting the administration's illegal activities, and the Nicaraguan government sued the United States. Dozens of court cases were filed, and National Security Council officials, including new national security advisors, faced multiple indictments. Now, finally, following the terrorist acts of September 11, 2001, a handful of government officials made the unilateral judgment that following U.S. surveillance law, as it was commonly understood, would slow down the government's ability to track suspected terrorists. Instead of working with the Congress, instead of coming to the Congress and asking to revise or update the law, these officials secretly reinterpreted the law to justify a warrantless wiretapping program that they hid from virtually every member of the Congress and the American people. It's not clear how long they thought they could hide a large, controversial national security program of this nature, but they kept it so secret that even when it yielded useful intelligence, classification restrictions sometimes prevented the information from being shared with officials who could have used it. I was a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee at this point a relatively new member, but the program and the legal interpretations that supported it were kept secret from me and virtually all of my colleagues. Again, did that program stay secret? The answer is no, Mr. President. After several years, the New York Times published a story uncovering the program. The resulting public uproar led to a divisive congressional debate and a significant number of lawsuits. In my view, the disclosure also led to an erosion of public trust that made many private companies more reluctant to cooperate with government inquiries. As most of my colleagues will remember, Congress and the executive branch spent years trying to sort out the details of that particular program and the secret legal interpretation that was used to justify it. In the process of doing so, Congress also attempted to address some actual surveillance policy issues. I think almost all of my colleagues who were here for that debate would agree that those issues could have been resolved far more easily, far less contentiously, if the Bush administration had simply come to the Congress in the first place and tried to work out a bipartisan solution to them, rather than, in effect, trying to rewrite the law in secret. When laws are secretly reinterpreted this way, the results frequently fail to stand up to public scrutiny. And it's not surprising if you think about it. The American lawmaking process is often cumbersome here, it's often frustrating, and it's certainly contentious. But over the long run, this process is a pretty good way to ensure that our laws have the support of the American people, since those that don't will actually get revised or repealed by elected lawmakers who follow the will of our constituents. On the other hand, when laws are secretly reinterpreted behind closed doors by a small number of government officials, and there's no public scrutiny, no public debate, you're certainly more likely to end up with interpretations of the law that go well beyond the boundaries of what the American people are willing to accept. Now, let me make clear that I think it's entirely legitimate for government agencies to keep some information secret. In a democratic society, of course, citizens rightly expect that government will not arbitrarily keep information from them, and throughout our nation's history, Americans have vigilantly guaranteed their right to know. But Americans do acknowledge certain limited exceptions to the principle of openness. We know, for example, that tax officials have information about all of us from our tax returns, but the government doesn't have the right or the need to share this information openly. This is essentially an exception to protect personal privacy. Another limited exception exists for the protection of national security. The U.S. government has an inherent responsibility to protect our people from threats. And to do this effectively, it almost always requires some measure of secrecy. I don't expect General Petraeus to publicly discuss the details of every troop movement in Afghanistan any more than early Americans expected George Washington to publish his strategy for the Battle of Yorktown. By the same token, American citizens recognize that their government may sometimes rely on secret intelligence collection methods in order to ensure national security, in order to ensure the safety of the American people, and they recognize that these methods can often be more effective when specifics are kept secret. But while Americans recognize that government agencies sometimes rely on secret sources and methods to collect intelligence information, Americans also expect that these agencies will cooperate at all times within the boundaries of publicly understood law. Now, I have served on the Senate Intelligence Committee for a decade, and I don't take a backseat to anybody when it comes to protecting what are essential sources and methods that are needed to keep the American people safe when intelligence is being gathered. But I don't believe the law should ever be kept secret. Voters have a right and a need to know what the law says and what their government thinks the text of the law means. And that's essential so the American people can decide whether the law is appropriately written, and they're in a position to ratify or reject the decisions their elected officials make on their behalf. When it comes to most government functions, the public can directly observe the government's actions, and the typical citizen can decide for themselves whether they support or agree with the things that their government is doing. Certainly in my part of the world, American citizens can visit the national forests and decide whether they think the forests are appropriately managed. When they drive on the interstate, they can decide for themselves whether those highways have been properly laid out and adequately maintained. If they see someone punished, they can decide for themselves whether the sentence was appropriate, whether it was too harsh or too lenient. But Americans generally can't decide for themselves whether intelligence agencies are operating within the law or not. That's why the U.S. intelligence community evolved over the past several decades. The Congress set up a number of watchdog and oversight mechanisms to ensure that the intelligence agencies followed the law rather than violated. That's why the Senate and House each have a select intelligence committee. It's also why the Congress created the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and it's why Congress created a number of statutory inspectors general to act as independent watchdogs inside the intelligence agencies themselves. All of these oversight entities were created, at least in part, to ensure that intelligence agencies carry out all of their activities within the boundaries of publicly understood law. But the law itself must always be public. Government officials must not be allowed to fall into the trap of secretly reinterpreting the law in a way that creates a gap between what the public believes the law says and what the government secretly claims it says. Anytime that happens, it seems to me there's going to be a violation of the public trust. Furthermore, allowing a gap of this nature to develop is simply short-sighted. Both history and logic should make it clear, and that's why I brought these examples to the floor of the Senate today, that secret interpretations of the law will not stay secret forever and, in fact, often come to light pretty quickly. When the public eventually finds out that government agencies have been rewriting surveillance law in secret, the result, as I've demonstrated, is invariably a backlash and an erosion of public confidence in these government agencies. Mr. President, I believe that this is a big and growing problem. Now, our intelligence and national security agencies are staffed by many talented and dedicated men and women. The work they do is very important, and for the most part, they are extraordinarily professional. But when members of the public lose confidence in these agencies, it just doesn't undercut morale. It makes it harder for these agencies to do their jobs. If you ask the head of any intelligence agency, particularly an agency that is involved in domestic surveillance in any kind of way, he or she will tell you that public trust is the coin of the realm. It is a vital commodity, and voluntary cooperation from law-abiding Americans is just critical to the effectiveness of our intelligence agencies. If members of the public lose confidence in these government agencies because they think government officials are rewriting surveillance law in secret, it is going to make those agencies less effective. And as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I don't want to see that happen. I want to wrap up now with just one last comment, and that is that as you look at these statutes, and particularly the ones that I've outlined where you have so many hardworking lawyers and officials at these government agencies, I want to make it clear that I don't believe that these officials have a malicious intent. They are working hard to protect intelligence sources and methods, and for good reasons. But sometimes they can lose sight of the differences between the sources and methods which must be kept secret and the law itself which should not. Sometimes they even go so far as to argue that keeping their interpretation of the law secret is actually necessary because it prevents our nation's adversaries from figuring out what our intelligence agencies are allowed to do. Now, I can see how it might be tempting to latch on to this Alice in Wonderland logic. But if the U.S. government were to actually adopt it, then all of our surveillance laws would be kept secret, because that would obviously be even more useful. When Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, it would have been useful to keep that law secret from the KGB so that Soviet agents wouldn't know whether the FBI was allowed to track them. But American laws shouldn't be public only when government officials think it's convenient. They ought to be public, and public all the time. And the American people ought to be able to find out what their government thinks those laws mean. Now, earlier this week, Mr. President, I filed an amendment along with my colleague from the Intelligence Committee, Senator Mark Udall, and that amendment would require the Attorney General to publicly disclose the United States government official interpretation of the USA Patriot Act. The amendment specifically states the Attorney General should not describe any particular intelligence collection programs or activities, but that there should be a full description of the legal interpretation and analysis necessary to understand the government's official interpretation of the law. Now, this morning, Senator Udall and I, and had the help of several colleagues, Senator Merkley, Senator Tom Udall, we reached an agreement with the chair of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Feinstein. She's going to be holding hearings on this issue next month. Senator Udall and I, as members of the committee, will be in a position to go into those hearings and the subsequent deliberations, be in a position to try to amend the intelligence authorization. And if we don't get results inside the committee because of the agreement today with the distinguished chair of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Feinstein, the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, we will be in a position to come back to this floor and offer our original amendment this fall. Now, we're going to keep fighting for openness and honesty. As of today, the government's official interpretation of the law is still secret. Still secret, Mr. President, and I believe that there is a growing gap as of this afternoon between what the public believes that law says and the secret interpretation of the Justice Department. So I plan to vote no this afternoon on this legislation, because I said some time ago that a long-term reauthorization of this legislation did require significant reforms. And I believe that when more members of Congress and the American people come to understand how the Patriot Act has actually been interpreted in secret, I think the number of Americans who support significant reform and the end of secret law, the end of law that is kept secret from them by design, I think we will see Americans joining us in this cause to ensure that in the days ahead, as we protect our country from the dangerous threats that we face, we are also doing a better job of being sensitive to individual liberty. Those philosophies, those critical principles are what this country is all about, and we are going to stay at it, Senator Udall and I and others, until those changes are secured. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today in conjunction with my colleague from Oregon to discuss what's before us here on the floor, which is the extension of the Patriot Act. And I rise as well to express my opposition to the extension of the three most controversial provisions of the Patriot Act, which are before us here today. The process by which we've considered these provisions has been rushed, and I believe we've done a disservice to the American people by not having a fuller and more open debate about these provisions. Now, I think along with Senator Wyden, I want to acknowledge the difficult position that the Leader of the Senate has been in, Senator Reid. and I want to thank him for trying to find an agreement to vote on more amendments. We were very close to reaching that agreement. But even in that context, the debate we've had on this bill is insufficient, and if you look at what we're about to approve, it's a one-page bill which just changes the dates in the existing Patriot Act. This is a lost opportunity, Mr. President. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I can tell you that what most people, including many members of Congress, believe is that the Patriot Act allows the government to do what it allows the government to do, and what government officials privately believe the Patriot Act allows them to do. Those are two different things. Senator Wyden has been making that case, and I want to make it as well. And I can't support the extension of the provisions we're considering today without amendments to ensure that there's a check on executive branch authority. And I don't believe that the Coloradans who sent me here to represent them would accept this extension either. Mr. President, Americans would be alarmed if they knew how this law is being carried out. I appreciate the Intelligence Committee Chairwoman, Dianne Feinstein, working with us to hold hearings in the committee to examine how the administration is interpreting the law. I believe that is a critical step forward. However, that addresses only the overarching concern. I still have concerns about the individual provisions that we are considering today. We just voted to invoke cloture, to cut off debate on the 4-year extension of provisions that give the government wide-ranging authority to conduct wiretaps on groups and individuals or collect private citizens' records. And I voted no because the debate should not be over without a real chance to improve these authorities. I recently supported a 3-month extension so that the Senate could take time to debate and amend the Patriot Act. We were promised that debate. But that opportunity is literally slipping through our hands. I'd like to stay here and continue making the case to the American people that this bill should and could be improved. Now, Mr. President, while a number of Patriot Act provisions are permanent and remain in place to give our intelligence community important tools to fight terrorism, the 3 controversial provisions we are debating, commonly known as roving wiretap, lone wolf, and business records, are ripe for abuse and threaten Americans' constitutional freedoms. Now, I know we must balance the principles of liberty and security, and I firmly believe that terrorism is a serious threat to the United States, and we must be sharply focused on protecting the American people. In fact, with my seats on the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, much of my attention is centered on keeping Americans safe, both here and abroad. And I also recognize that despite Osama bin Laden's death, we still live in a world where terrorism is a serious threat to our country, our economy, and to American lives. Our government does need the appropriate surveillance and anti-terrorism tools to achieve these important goals. However, we need to and we can strike a better balance between protecting our national security and the constitutional freedoms of our people. Let me give you an example. This debate has failed to recognize that current surveillance programs need improved public oversight and accountability. I know that Americans believe that we ought to only use Patriot Act powers to investigate terrorist or espionage-related targets. Yet Section 215 of the Patriot Act, the so-called business records provision, currently allows records to be collected on law-abiding Americans without any connection to terrorism or espionage. If we cannot limit investigations to terrorism or other nefarious activities, where do they end? The Coloradans are demanding that in addition to the review of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, we place common-sense limits on government investigations and link data collection to terrorist or espionage-related activities. Or should I say, when Congress passes this bill to extend the Patriot Act until 2015, it will mean that for 4 more years, the federal government will have access to private information about Americans who have no connection to terrorism without sufficient accountability and without real public awareness about how these powers are used. Again, I want to underline, we all agree the intelligence community needs effective tools to combat terrorism, but we must provide these tools in a way that protects the constitutional freedoms of our people and lives up to the standard of transparency that democracy demands. And again, I want to say that as a member of the Intelligence Committee, while I cannot say how this authority is being used, I believe it is ripe for potential abuse and must be improved to protect the constitutionally protected privacy rights of individual, innocent American citizens. Toward that goal, I've worked with my colleagues to come up with common-sense fixes that could receive bipartisan support. For example, Senator Wyden and I filed an amendment that would require the Department of Justice to disclose the official legal interpretation of the provisions of the Patriot Act. This would make sure that the federal government is only using these powers in ways the American people believe they are authorizing them to. And while I believe that our intelligence practices should be kept secret, I do not believe that the government's official interpretation of these laws should be kept secret. This is an important part of our oversight duties, and I look forward to working with Chairwoman Feinstein in the Intelligence Committee to ensure that this oversight occurs. I've also filed my own amendments to address some of the problems I see with the roving wiretap, lone wolf, and business record provisions. For example, I joined Senator Wyden in filing an amendment designed to narrow the scope of the business records materials that can be collected under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. And I just highlighted some of the problems with that provision. Our amendment would still allow enforcement agencies to use the Patriot Act to obtain investigation records, but it would also require those entities to demonstrate that the records are in some way connected to terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities. Today, law enforcement currently can obtain any kind of records. In fact, the Patriot Act's only limitation states that such information has to be related to, quote, any tangible thing, unquote. That's right. As long as these business records are related to any tangible thing, the U.S. government can require businesses to turn over information on their customers, whether or not there's a link to terrorism or espionage. I got to say, I just don't think it's unreasonable to ask that our law enforcement agencies identify a terrorism or espionage investigation before collecting the private information of law-abiding American citizens. These amendments, Mr. President, represent but a few of the reform ideas that we could have debated this week. But without further debate on these issues, this or any other administration, whether intentionally or unintentionally, can abuse the Patriot Act. And because of the need to keep classified material classified, Congress cannot publicly fulfill our oversight responsibilities on behalf of the American people. So, Mr. President, as I started out my remarks, I plan to vote against the reauthorization of these three expiring provisions because we failed to implement any reforms that would sensibly restrain these overbroad provisions. In the nearly 10 years since Congress passed the Patriot Act, there's been very little opportunity to improve this law. And I, for one, am very disappointed that we are once again being rushed into approving policies that threaten the privacy, which under one definition is the freedom to be left alone of the American people. It's a fundamental element and principle of freedom. The bill is before us today, in my opinion, doesn't live up to the balanced standards the framers of our Constitution envisioned to protect both liberty and security, and I believe it seriously risks the constitutional freedoms of our people. And by passing this unamended reauthorization, we are ensuring that Americans will live with the status quo for 4 more long years. I'm disappointed, and I know that many of our constituents would be disappointed if they were able to understand the implications of our inaction on these troubling issues. Mr. President, as I close, I just want to say there's a gravitational pull to secrecy that I think we all have as human beings. It's hard to resist it, and the whole point of the checks and balances that our founders put in place was to ensure that power couldn't be consolidated and then power abused, again, whether intentionally or unintentionally. We'd all like to be king for a day. We all have ideas about how we could make the world a better place. But we know the dangers in giving that much of power to one person or one small group of people. Ben Franklin put it so well. I can't do justice to his remarks in the way that he stated them, but to paraphrase him, he said that a society that would trade essential liberty for short-term security deserves neither. And our job as senators is to ensure that we actually enjoy both of those precious qualities, security and liberty. So thank you, Mr. President. This is an important vote today. This is an important undertaking, and I know we can, through the leadership of Senator Wyden and many of us who care deeply about this, ensure that the Patriot Act keeps faith with the principles that we hold dear. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you.